Welcome to the Collective Impact Forum's March Virtual Coffee. I am Jennifer Juster, Director of the Collective Impact Forum, and we are so delighted to have you with us here today. Today we're hosting our second virtual coffee, and this is a new format for us to have conversations with people around the field who are engaged in collective impact work. As you likely know, today's conversation will run for about 60 minutes. We will spend about half of our time together with me chatting with Deb, our guest for the day, and then we'll open up to questions for you all. So as we are talking, please feel free to note questions, and you can type them into the chat box on your screen to submit them to us. In addition, one housekeeping note I will share up front is that we are recording this virtual coffee, and we will make a link to the chat available after the fact in case you'd like to share it with any of your colleagues. So as a reminder, up on the screen now, you can ask questions using the Q&A box on the right of your screen. You can also feel free to use Twitter to share any interesting nuggets that you're learning along the way. And if you do have any technical questions, you can email info@collectiveimpactforum.org with those, and my colleague Tracy will be monitoring that inbox. So before we launch into our conversation with Deb, we want to just get a little bit more of a sense of who is on the line. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Robert, who will take us through a poll to understand where everyone is calling in from.
Great. Thanks, Jen. I'm just launching the poll, so for those of you who are following along on the webinar, you should see a poll that has just popped up. I'm seeing responses come through right now. We'll just take maybe 10 seconds. The question here, what geographic area does your work focus on? So thanks to those of you. I see about half of you have already responded to the poll, which is great, and I will share the results in maybe 5 more seconds. All right. Interesting to see the results here. So we've got about a fourth of you are in a rural area, 13% in a small city, 20% in a large city, 37% multi-region, and 5% other. So very interesting to see the mix.
Thanks, Robert. Yes, and welcome everyone. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's guest, Deb Halliday. Deb brings over 25 years of experience working with communities to tackle complex issues. She's a community builder and a master facilitator. I actually got to know Deb a little bit better when she presented on a practitioner panel of backbone organizations at the Collective Impact Forum's Champions for Change event last fall. And we are just so glad to have Deb with us. So I'm actually just going to start by asking Deb to tell us a little bit more about herself and her collective impact work.
Hi there. Thanks, Jen. I appreciate the invitation to be a part of this conversation with everybody. So a little bit about where I'm coming from and my most recent experience that relates to collective impact. I live in Montana, which for folks who are more familiar with the East Coast, Montana is as large as the distance between Washington, D.C. and Chicago, Illinois, with the population of Delaware. So what we have is, you know, sort of small cities and a lot of land and, you know, mountain passes and ranch lands in between those places. Our largest city is Billings, which is 100,000. So just to kind of give you that context. And so most recently, and we'll be talking a little bit about this project on this call, most recently I served as a political appointee of an elected official at our state's Office of Public Instruction. And so I was charged with building some of our strategic initiatives, and one of those was called Graduation Matters Montana, that resulted in the state's highest high school graduation rate for 2 years running, and at the height of its work, 50 different communities in Montana were actively engaged with collective impact light framework. And so we were able to, from a state agency perspective, serve as sort of that Uber backbone that provides technical assistance and some private sector funding and that learning community and leadership to support the work happening at the local level. So we'll chat a little bit about that. And now, as of the beginning of this year, I am no longer at the Office of Public Instruction. Our term was over, and so we shifted out of the administration. And I'm working on my own on projects. The first project I'm working on is on behalf of a private foundation here in Montana to help them think through what would a statewide collective impact initiative to advance early learning opportunities in the state look like. And so I can talk a little bit about how we're structuring that work.
Great, thank you, Deb. So yeah, let's spend a little bit of time starting by learning more about Graduation Matters Montana. And you already mentioned a little bit about the structure, but I've often heard it referred to as a nested collective impact initiative. So the statewide Uber backbone, as you mentioned, and then local collective impact work happening at the community level. So can you tell us a little bit more about what that looked like, what was happening vis-a-vis collective impact locally, and then what was happening at the state level?
You bet. So nested collective impact, I love that phrase because it really does, I think, represent what we were doing in the state, which is recognizing that change happens when people change their behaviors and their relationships and systems work differently with one another. And that's most tangible and most impactful at that local level where the people that you're hoping to support are actively interfacing with those people and those systems. And so our work was very grounded in supporting the capacity of local communities to do their work together. So the tagline of Graduation Matters Montana is locally designed, locally implemented based on what works in Montana. So really recognizing that local people need to be engaged in the work. And so there's that wonderful phrase that Margaret Wheatley is credited for saying, people own that which they help to build. And so we understood that if we really wanted to engage people in doing the hard work of collaboration and collective impact, they needed to really own that work. And so with collective impact, one of the values I see in collective impact is it provides a common framework and common language and puts data in the center of that conversation. And so what we had was communities all working on a similar framework and having common language around what it is that they were trying to do, but the actual work that they were doing differed based on the capacities and the needs of their local community. And so what that meant was it really short-circuited the challenges around, you know, talking the same language about a particular issue. And so we would say, you know, if you have brought together that multiple stakeholder group, you've emphasized having students with a direct or one-step removed experience of dropping out of school, they're in the conversation with you. Together you look at your qualitative and quantitative data, and you get to that point of looking at, well, what are we doing already that's really good, and what do we need to be working on to improve it? We would say, rather than Google peer-to-peer tutoring, call us and we can tell you about great peer-to-peer tutoring things happening in our state in communities kind of like yours. And so really being able to be that network piece for the local communities. And so if you look at sort of the pristine functions of a backbone organization, the state government, vis-a-vis me and the Graduation Matters Montana work, we were that convener. We brought in $1.3 million of private sector funds, the lion's share of which went into local communities to support their work, really only in grants of up to $5,000 or $10,000 a year, but that created the space and the expectation that a group of people would come together and work that framework and then come together once a summer to share what was working and not working. So we provided that convening, we provided a leadership voice that this matters. We, as a state agency, we collect a lot of data on schools. With or without them, we have to gather their data, and so we felt very responsible to package the relevant pieces of data that would inform and drive local work. So, you know, for instance, in the particulars of the context of Graduation Matters Montana, that's how many kids from what grades are graduating or dropping out. What do we know about credit recovery or credit accumulation, so kids are making their way through their grades and getting the credits they need to graduate. What do we know about their college going rates? Those kinds of data points that we already gathered as a state agency, we would package them and we'd give them back to the local community to work on that.
Yeah, that's a really powerful role for a state agency to be playing. And I'm also curious if you could talk a little bit about, given you have the statewide infrastructure, what did that mean for the role that a local backbone was playing in the local community?
Well, this is where we get very specific to what is hard and what is possible in rural communities. So in a lot of rural communities, one of the biggest challenges is the lack of organizational infrastructure. So you have small organizations with small staff who, do incredible work with the resources they have, but they're very challenged around their time resources and their dollar resources to do more than they're already doing. And so where a local community in Montana has a United Way, we were really able to ground the work at the United Way, and so the United Way served as that backbone. And the alignment of United Way Worldwide's data points that they benchmark around education were very aligned with Graduation Matters. And so ready for kindergarten, reading on third grade level, graduating from high school, those are all data points that the United Way Worldwide was looking to local United Way affiliates to try to get a handle on and move the dial on. And so that work was very aligned with Graduation Matters. And so sometimes the capacity grants, those grants of up to $10,000 a year, sometimes they would go to the United Way to help pay for part of the staffing and convening time of that particular organization. But, most of our communities do not have a United Way. And so then it's looking at, well, who in the local community has some staffing capacity to do this work, to do the convening work, to, do the shuttle diplomacy that often happens when you're trying to get diverse groups of people and organizations to align. And that would often be, with this particular project, the education community. So we would look for a school district to assign, 10 or 15 or 20% of their time, one staff person's time, to be that point person for the Graduation Matters team. And so what kept that together and advancing itself is that we sort of wrapped our services and supports around those people. So they got a little grant. They had access to me, and I had a couple coaches who worked around the state and would, drive out to Wolf Point or up to Whitefish and visit with a team. We have toolkits, Graduation Matters toolkits that take a team through the framework of Graduation Matters with very concrete examples from local Montana communities of what each of the different components look like. So, for instance, what are likely people who often populate a team, and how do you engage student voice in that conversation, and what are some data points that you could gather, and what do you do once you have data sitting on your table, right? So we would have examples of critical questions that you could ask your team in which to engage around the data points. And so each of those local backbone point people were not just doing their work in isolation of one another. We were constantly knitting, constantly telling the story of other possible and positive work that was happening in the state. And then we would do, that continuous communication piece. I would write and distribute roughly once a month an email to the several thousand people, the list ended up growing to be, of of concrete examples of good things happening around the state. So that whole mindset shift that possible is possible, that we can get good things to happen if we're intentional, if we have a framework that we're working, if we understand that so much of this is about productive, transparent relationships. So if you get those kinds of parts of the culture of this work deeply embedded in the initiative, then all sorts of great things start to arise within local communities, and it's just a matter of keeping up with it sometimes.
Wow, that's great. And you already actually begun to speak a little bit to the next question I was thinking of asking, Deb, which is what are some of the unique dimensions of doing collective impact work in more rural settings? So challenges and or opportunities that you think that presents.
Sure. Well, I know that a lot of us like to quote the Stephen Covey comment that progress moves at the speed of trust. And I think that rural communities really have tremendous opportunity to build on that concept. So, one thing about rural communities is, at least in Montana, very few people move to Montana to become rich and famous. It's not really, in the jet set crowd, other than I guess some of them come and ski once in a while. But the people who are building the communities, who are living in the communities, raising their families in the communities, dying in the communities, those are people who want to live in Montana because they think it's is a beautiful place to live, a place that affords them a quality of life that they value. And so there's a common element in there about caring about your community, right? And so those relationships that people have are really, they can be very deep, and they can be very ready for that next step in kind of shifting to another way to think about work. Another thing about rural communities, and this is even goes right up to our state government level, is that they're relatively non-hierarchical, flat economies. And so it's not, I grew up in upstate New York, and did some work in the city of New York as well, New York City as well as Boston, and I can really appreciate that there are often multiple layers of people and systems and processes that isolate leaders of systems far from the work on the ground, right? In rural states and rural communities, that hierarchy is relatively flat, and so it wasn't super hard for us to get, my boss, the state superintendent, in the same room with the person who is in charge of the Health and Human Services division of the state with the governor or the governor's right-hand man, and so that hierarchical flatness allows for people to start more quickly discerning how systems work with one another and don't work with one another. So, one of the essential core values or understandings I have about this kind of work is that, in general, people want to know that the work that they do makes a difference. They want to know that, the sleepless nights and the tears of frustration, it all adds up to something. And so if you work from an assumption that most people in this sort of social services, social change world are trying to figure out how to have greater impact, then a whole bunch of things can open up in terms of finding common places to do work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and as someone who lives in a large urban area, I can really understand those differences and some of the benefits and the challenges that poses, for sure. I have a few more questions I'm going to be asking Deb, but this is also a friendly reminder that if you have questions, we'd love to hear them, and you can put them in the question box on the GoToMeeting platform. And while we're gathering a few more of your questions, Deb, a couple more that I have for you. You talked about sort of seeing progress in those results as being really galvanizing for people. Can you tell me a couple of results or pieces of data that you're particularly proud of Graduation Matters having accomplished?
In those kind of collaborative efforts?
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's a good example. If there's that there's that core value of, I think that it's an old disabilities rights cry, nothing about us without us, right? And that I think it was Paul Bourne from Tamarack who said, you know, that so much of the innovation in our work comes from actively engaging people with lived experience to understand the challenges and the possible solutions to any challenge. So with Graduation Matters Montana, we put a tremendous focus around students with a direct or one step removed experience of struggling to stay in school and helping adults figure out how to engage with those kids and give them a legitimate voice at the table. And so an example of that is there was a Graduation Matters Hardin, which is a small town right off the Crow Indian Reservation had a fairly significant dropout rate, and they started their Graduation Matters Hardin initiative, and they're like, okay, Deb says we have to engage kids, so let's bring some of them together. And they looked at the data together with the kids, and in that first fall semester, about 35 kids had dropped out of school. And I'm sorry I don't have the context for that, but that was a lot. You know, it wasn't 50%, but I think it was, you know, around a quarter, maybe not a quarter, but you know, a lot of kids. And the students said, well, those are our friends, they're our cousins. I mean, like, where are they now and why did they drop out? And so the students with the adults constructed a survey, and the students in pretty short order were able to find those kids who dropped out of school because they were their friends and family members, and they were able to bring data back to the Graduation Matters team about why did kids drop out, what would bring them back in again, you know, and that totally enlivened the conversation of the team. So it wasn't, you know, well-intended adults sitting around a table trying to figure out, well, maybe we should try a new tutoring program, or maybe we should try, you know, partnering with the substance abuse folks. So it's like they were able to really have students at the table, data gathered from the students to start informing the work that they would do. Another example of that was a small school that the school surveyed the students, and the students were saying, you know, we just don't feel like the teachers really care about us that much. And they probed on that, and an example of why students didn't feel like the kids cared about this, teachers cared about them, was that the teachers never come to their sporting events, and so they're aware of that. Then they talked to the teachers, and the teachers say, well, we would come, but the gymnasium is small, and it's really hard to get a seat. So the Graduation Matters team secured one bleacher bench and said reserved for teachers, and then teachers started coming, and then in the halls, you know, in the next day there's high fives, and there's this kind of a general community feeling that's going on in the school. And so that's a really good example of something that it's unlikely that anyone on the team, the Graduation Matters team, would have thought of, like, kids don't feel that psyched about school. I know, let's open up a bleacher for teachers. You know, that's too much of a leap. But by engaging students in the conversation, they were able to come up with a very low-cost, high-impact strategy.
Yeah, those are really great, very concrete examples. The power of really bringing the voice authentically into the conversation. One last question before I'm going to turn it to Robert to take some of our audience questions. You know, Deb, what communication strategies did you find most useful in connecting these efforts across the state? You mentioned email, but I'm also curious if you had any specific technology platforms, or really what sort of communications you used.
Yeah, great question. Particularly for rural states, the distances to travel are so extraordinary that that is a real barrier, and you know, transportation in general is a real barrier in rural communities. Even, you know, within a local community, you have a lot of people who live far away from the city center, and so like coming to meetings and getting services can be a real barrier. So we we didn't do a whole lot with technology. We tried to do a few webinars, but I don't know that we really had the knowledge base for that. We tried to do some of those video conferences, and that was always a little bit odd because, the camera would fall and you'd be looking at someone's socks or something like that. So what we ended up doing was, as I mentioned, we did these monthly emails that were very intentionally framed around aspiration, right, that look at all these things happening in these different places, and we would hyperlink news articles. So one of the benefits from having common language with Graduation Matters was it was Graduation Matters Hardin, and Graduation Matters Wolf Point, and Graduation Matters Billings, and Graduation Matters Kalispell. And so the media got very knowledgeable about what Graduation Matters was, and so it made it that much easier for a local community to talk to the media about good things happening in their school. And so we did a lot of coaching with local communities about how to communicate aspirationally about their work. So we would talk about, particularly in public sector work, like public education, there are always going to be a group of people who are not super supportive of public education. And what happens is that the people who are practitioners within public education are so busy doing the work in the trenches, they forget to tell the good stories, and then something bad happens, and it's the top of the fold, and it reinforces the naysayer's opinion that public education isn't good, right? And so we spent a lot of time working with local teams to think about telling their stories proactively, the good things happening. And so, part of that is really aided by having common language of a Graduation Matters initiative. And we had a pledge that students could take the pledge to graduate, and we would have a big community event around that. And so the media got pretty savvy about anything that sort of smelled of community, school, youth voice partnership, fell into a very positively framed a storyline for them, which made it much easier for local communities to pitch their stories to the media. And so another piece of that was that it made it very easy for communities to talk amongst one another. Like a new superintendent would come into a community and pick up the phone and say to another superintendent, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing one of these Graduation Matters initiatives. What do you know?" And that superintendent would say, "Oh, well, this is what we're doing around that," And so those were sort of ongoing, regular communications. We then had an annual summit that usually had about 200 people come, and that would be teachers and administrators and community organizations and business leaders and students, and it was structured in a very interactive way, so there was very little sit and get. It was all about getting practitioners together, because I think that one of the challenges we have in our change work is that people don't have enough time to reflect and connect around what the work is, what's really going on with our work, and connect to other practitioners. And so, it's too often that we go to conferences where you don't really even know who's in the room, and you just happen to be at a table somewhat randomly. Maybe you were assigned, maybe you weren't, and whether or not you relate to any of the people at your table is just happenstance. So what we would do at our summits is, I would call it a wedding party. We would assign teams to tables. So I would see who was coming, and I would pair teams that were sort of like-sized communities and like-sized economies, or I would pair them based on an issue that they were both working on. Like they might be working on a youth mentoring program, and I'd make sure that one community that was pretty advanced in their youth mentoring work would be sitting with two communities that were not particularly advanced, they were just getting going. And that at each table, I'd also place a facilitator that I trained and walked through the agenda ahead of time, so that was basically a table host to make sure that everybody's connecting, that they're pretty much staying on track with the conversations that were happening. So we were very intentional about structuring the learning community environment to get people feeling like the possible is possible.
Nice, that's great. Hey, Robert, I'm going to turn it over to you to take some of our audience questions.
Sounds great. We've had a great number of questions already come through, and we'll do our best to cover as many as possible. I'm going to start with one that's come up from several of you on the webinar. There's a couple questions, Deb, that have come through around data. So in particular, someone asked, can you share some information about what your data sharing systems and infrastructure look like? And a related question was, do you have any recommendations for smaller organizations for collecting data and easily sharing it, maybe other than just using Excel? So any guidance you have on the data sharing, gathering front?
Yeah, so as a state agency, we actually had data staff people, right, who I worked with to manage the gathering and the dissemination of the data that we wanted to equip local teams to use. And so that was kind of 3-year trend data on different aspects of graduating or dropping out or going to college. And so we would provide that kind of that kind of data in worksheets for local communities to work off of. And any writing that you do for public consumption, the data as well, everything I learned years ago that you should try to aim your work to a 5th grade reading level or a 5th grade comprehension level around numbers too. So not a lot of data points, but pertinent data points. So when I was wearing a state hat, that was the way that I did that work. Now that I'm back out doing kind of community work and I'm interfacing with local school districts and local city county health departments and local child care referral organizations and local government, what I'm asking for is, how do you know how well our community is doing in your particular part of the puzzle? So, elementary school district, what do you know about kids coming in at kindergarten as far as, their readiness to learn and what they were doing before they came to kindergarten? And with the child care folks, what do you know about the mismatch or the matchup of supply and demand, of families needing affordable quality child care and the community's ability to provide that, right? And so pretty much every organization has some data that they're gathering, and so then it's asking, a lot of times, in rural areas we lack the staffing capacity to be all that reflective about the data that we gather. We're just kind of churning it out for this or the other thing. And so having someone who is trying to build a collective impact initiative or framework for a community to provide some of the good critical questions around, what do we know and how would we communicate that? So just to extend that a little bit, part of the challenge around some of our work is, how do we engage the business community? How do we find, that overlap with them? And one of the earliest things that you have to sort out is, how do we get them to know about and care about this issue? And so when we start asking ourselves, well, what do we understand about the issue that we're working on? What is what little data that we do have, maybe, what does it tell us? And making sure that we're not just falling for the trap of trying to tell a terrible story. You should care because kids are in crisis. It's like that, I think, has been proven time and again to stultify innovation, to make people not necessarily want to join your group because they're overwhelmed by the seemingly, unmet needs that you're trying to deal with. So when you start looking at your data and trying to get a point in time and get some context for, both what's happened in the last 5 years, how does it relate to our state, to our country, try to find some positive part of that picture to say to a business person or someone who you're just trying to bring onto your team, we know that this is an issue, but we also know we're really good at some of these things, and so that gives us hope that if we try this new thing, something new will happen. And as far as data just on the Graduation Matters initiative, in the 6 years of that initiative, we continued to raise the graduation rate. So it started at about 81%, and we got it up to 86% in that time. And the last 2 years of the work had the highest state graduation rate in the state's history. And that translated to thousands more children graduating every year. So we were really proud of that.
Great. Thanks, Deb. The next questions I'll ask you too on this topic of the backbone roles and responsibilities. There's several questions that have come in on that thread. One thread is specifically if someone was interested in whether the backbone responsibility at a local level could potentially be shared across multiple organizations. That was something that came up on the last virtual coffee that we had, this idea of sometimes they can reside within one organization, but in other communities, sometimes you see the backbone responsibilities shared. So would love to hear your thoughts on whether you see that play out in practice in rural communities. And then the second question, which you can take after that, is related to the backbones. More interested in the kind of Uber backbone concept and whether that is best residing within a public sector entity, within a university, just any other reflections on now that you've seen that kind of nested backbone or nested collective impact effort, any reflections on the backbone role and where it could be structured at a state level?
Yeah, you bet. These are great questions. And isn't this fun? I love this format. I'm so glad I don't have to do a PowerPoint, so kudos to you guys for putting on virtual coffees. So I think that the sharing of the backbone functions between multiple organizations is a super smart way to go in our rural communities. Right now I'm helping to build this statewide initiative of collective impact around early learning, and I'm looking at our rural communities. And my first question is, where's the capacity? So there's interest and there's capacity. And so in most of our organizations, you know, there's, well, let me start that over. In our rural communities, there are standard institutions that get things done. So there's the school district. In many of Montana's communities, the school building is the largest building in town, right? And so that's staff at some capacity. Then there is an infrastructure of the public health community where pretty much every county has something going on and some staffing around public health. And then depending on the size of the community, when you start getting into the bigger communities, you have United Ways or nonprofit organizations or chambers of commerce. So figuring out sort of where's the capacity in this community, and also particularly around some of these kind of, you know, archetypal issues like children and health, or, you know, suicide prevention, or, you know, trauma. A lot of people are doing work in trauma right now. There's often a table that's already set in the local community of people who are coming together to share information. And so looking at that table strategically and saying, okay, what's the purpose of that table? Is it that table coming together mainly just to inform one another about what's going on, or are they actually co-creating new strategies? And usually what I've found, at least in our rural areas, is that you get one table and it tends to devolve to kind of informing with a couple coordinated activities they do together in the year. And sitting at the table, there's always, you know, a group of people who are like, man, I want to get more done. I don't want to just go to another meeting and talk about stuff we talk about. So figuring out how can you pick off some of those people who want to be change agents and want to be collaborating and help them start to familiarize themselves with the collective impact framework and connect with other people trying to do that work. And so a very tangible example of that is right now in this early learning work I'm doing. There's a gal at our local United Way that part of her job is to staff a coalition around early learning, and there's a gal at the public health department whose part of her job is to help staff some of that work. And so there's two, you know, part-time people who want to be doing this work, who are invested in this work, and who are open to engaging in exploring how the collective impact framework can support their work. So I say have at it. I think I might have a hard time thinking about more than 2 organizations, maybe 3 at the most, but then if you have too many sharing all the duties, I think you end up needing a backbone for your backbone. I'm sure there's a technical term for that. And then with the Uber backbone, I think that there's a tremendous capacity that public sector, state government, or in our bigger cities, the government, they have capacity. They have staff, they have office space, they have color copiers and secretaries and media people, and so where you can find sort of future forward public servants who want to be having an impact, I'd say just make a beeline for them and try to figure out how to get them to play a more aggressive role in convening and technical assistance and support for this work. But we know that there are a lot of public sector elected officials and appointees who are not particularly super psyched about expanding the pie. So if you have those, I think it's hard to see them as a potential backbone candidate. The other part of this work with Graduation Matters, which was so interesting to me, was the public-private partnership that we had. So the public sector, our state government, we provided the staffing and the operational costs and the convening costs and all that kind of stuff. The private sector, the foundations and the corporations, they provided money for the innovation. Right? So we were able to give grants to local communities and let the communities define how they would structure that money and build their work. And so the foundation dollars both provided some capacity, but almost as importantly, they did what I call the blue ribbon effect of telling a local community, hey, AT&T and State Farm and the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, they're funding our work. Like, those are our big corporations, and that feels good. Like, our work matters. They care about it too. And so, again, going back to that sort of mindset shifts around possibility, it's like somebody's noticing that my work is important, and they're willing to support that work. And so that the combination of that public-private sector partnership and collective impact, I think, is very promising.
Great, thanks, Deb, for providing that additional detail. I wanted to get back. There continues to be a good amount of interest around some of the things you talked about around data, and one other question that came up that I wanted to circle back to. Someone was particularly interested in the specific kind of technology tools or platforms that you use to gather data. Do you have any thoughts on ways that you actually reported back data to data providers, or just more specifics on kind of the concrete kind of technology or tools that you use to share data, gather data?
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot more to add to that because I'm speaking mainly from the state government perspective around that data, and we have, as a state government, you have these online platforms that people have to, schools would have to upload all their data onto, and so I think our value added in the collective impact work was that we then asked our data folks about specific to give us specific information about all that. They would have this huge data, bank, and we'd say, well, tell us in this particular community, tell us the graduation rates for the last 3 years, what that trend is, both percentages of people dropping out as well as hard numbers, and then tell us, break that down by a demographic cut, break that down by grades, by grades, and so then, what that allowed us to do, the pivot for us around the data was, how do you workshop data? So, it's not enough, in general, a maxim I have in my work is, it's not enough to give people information, it's up to you to help interpret why that information is important, right? And so we would provide that kind of information, and then we would say, well, what do you understand from looking at this, and what isn't that clear to you? What more would you want to know, and can you get that information? And so the power of bringing together lots of different people onto a team. You know, you'd have your educators who swim in this work all the time, but then you'd have a Main Street business owner and a nonprofit person and a couple students. And so those were kind of the non-educators, right? And they would say, wow, so 16 kids dropped out of school in their junior year, and what's that about? Like, you know, who are they and where are they now? So it kind of pushed beyond just numbers and into inquiry, right? And so as far as sort of the technical platform stuff, I don't think that we're particularly technical here in Montana in general, but it was more about how do you drive a better conversation about what you understand is working and not working, and how do you track that over time to know if what you're doing is having impact.
Got it. Thanks, Deb. There's several other questions that have come through kind of vary by stage of collective impact, but they all have a common thread around momentum. So how do you build momentum? How do you sustain momentum? So the next two questions we'll kind of look at them from different ends of the pipeline. So for initiatives that are in a community that are just getting started, any thoughts on specific challenges that you've seen with getting a group up and running? You know, any guidance that you have there on the earlier stages of the journey. My next question will be on the later stages, but to take that first part around, kind of how do you initially build momentum?
You bet. So I just actually wrote a blog called 100 Cups of Coffee. And this is an idea that, you know, I probably picked up somewhere along the line and, you know, miscalled the name of it. But the idea is to have tremendous humility and curiosity about that which you are trying to impact. And seeing an issue or a challenge through with a beginner's mind. And so with any new initiative that I do, or when I coach others on them, I counsel to talk to lots of people about it. Anyone you can think of that has a direct or maybe slightly indirect relationship to that issue. And so with the early learning stuff, as I'm launching this new initiative, I'm having 100 cups of coffee. I'm talking to the school district, I'm talking to daycare providers and preschool providers and Head Starts and the churches and the city, county folks and the coalition members at the organizations and families that have you know, struggling to find affordable daycare and public health folks. I'm talking to anyone I can think of, and yeah, I think it's important to call it a cup of coffee because a cup of coffee could last maybe 45 minutes. If you really get rolling, it can go for an hour and a half, but it's not a huge time commitment, and it's an informal face-to-face conversation about the thing that you're trying to understand. And I'm not super formal about it, but I have in my mind some core questions that I probe on. So, you know, it's, you know, tell me what you see is working in the community. Tell me what you see has been hard in the community. If they've been in this field for a long time, what are the things that you've noticed change in this work over time? You know, the famous, if you had a magic wand, what would you want to see? And, you know, as you're 7 or 8 or 10 cups of coffee into that process, you begin to see opportunities and leverage points, right? You start to hear common refrains about things that kind of bug lots of people from lots of different perspectives of the issue, or you see how people have really misinterpreted one another's good intentions, and they're saying the same thing, but they don't think the other one is saying that same thing. And so it's a very non-judgmental, very open, collegial conversation. They're confidential. I don't go say, well, you know, Mary was just saying the other day. You know, it's like and so you're becoming to understand better the nuance of the issue. You're also importantly building relationships and building trust and building excitement amongst people that maybe this time around something might be different, right? And so just to be very concrete about that, how do you get something going? So I'm having cups of coffee and I'm driving people to a workshop that, not literally driving them, I'm hoping that they come to a workshop that I'm putting together in a few weeks, and it's a 6-hour workshop. And so the first 2 hours of the workshop is collective impact. What is it? Get people common language around what collective impact is. You know, I've developed or I've borrowed other people's worksheets to sort of have people become more reflective about what is what they currently do now, right, and how and what they're hoping to accomplish and how those might be misaligned, right? So giving people kind of a non-threatening space to learn a new framework. So that's the first third of the meeting. The second third of the meeting will be some systems mapping around the issue. So recognizing, because of my cups of coffee, we'll have a whole bunch of different kinds of people in the room. It'll be about 50 people, and some people will know each other and a lot of people won't know one another. So that's a huge asset for you as you're trying to map this work. So figuring out different ways for people to kind of get a richer sense of it, you know, as Russ Linden would say, you know, getting people up on the balcony and off the dance floor of the issue. And then the third of the gathering will be sort of a, so what? What are we going to make of this? What do we want to do about this? And so that's a way, I think, to build momentum around an issue. I really like the 3 preconditions of collective impact, so that idea around urgency and adequate resources and leadership. So if you have leadership to just say, hey y'all, get in the room, this is important to me, that's awesome. But even if you have that, I still think as an organizer you should school yourself to have those cups of coffee, because you've gained such a richer understanding of where things are working and not working.
Great, thanks, Ted. I'll add one other quick follow-up on the kind of momentum side, and then I want to make sure we get to one other category. There's a good number of questions around kind of youth engagement and community engagement. The quick follow-up on the momentum front, beyond those questions around the early stage, there were others that are saying if you're in the mid to later stages, how do you kind of sustain momentum, particularly in more resource-constrained environments? Any other thoughts there? On just lessons learned, reflections on how to kind of sustain momentum, particularly in communities that might be smaller and not have as many resources.
Yeah, you bet. So I think I've mentioned this a couple of times, how much I appreciate the framework, the elegance of the model of collective impact. So you know, the elements of mutually reinforcing activities and continuous communication and a shared agenda and all that work, to me, that's a framework that's very facile, that it can call upon the best work of whatever the particular context or issue is that you're working on. And so I think that momentum begins to wane when people aren't seeing impact happen, right? Because collaboration is really hard. So why would people keep trying to push, you know, a rock up a hill if the hill gets bigger and the rock gets heavier? And so I think that it's important to be able to call the question once in a while with an initiative that's been around for a while to say, hey, let's take a pulse here. Like, what have we been able to do in the last 3 to 5 years in this? And what did we think we were going to try to do? And where have we made progress, but where are we really not getting to it? And then taking the temperature in the room of what do people really want to be working on related to this issue? And if it's not the same thing, then you start that rigor again around data and around coffee. And so, you know, don't just assume that the initial idea is not valid because it's not having impact. Maybe it's time to just kind of take the temperature in the room, because part of what makes this work so dynamic is it's a constantly changing context around our work, right? So new grants come in, organizations fail, political tides turn, and so we don't work in a stagnant environment. And so being real about that and having those conversations, I think, is really important.
Great, thanks, Deb. I appreciate you covering a lot of territory here. As I mentioned, another couple questions came through around the role of youth voice in your collective impact work. Talk a little bit about just how you get youth interested and engaged in this work, and just any other examples or quick reflections on youth involvement.
Yeah, you bet. So I love that term, and I you know, like everybody, we read so much, sometimes we lose track of who gave us a great idea, but I also like that term R&D, rip off and duplicate. So with apologies to the original thinkers behind this concept, I really like the idea of context experts and content experts, right? So content experts are a lot of us. We get training, we get educated, we have professional development, we get paid to know a lot about a particular thing. And then context experts are people who know how it really shakes out on the ground. And too often we have a lot of content experts, really well intended, coming up with their understanding of a problem and their understanding of an effective solution. And then they roll it out and it works or not, doesn't work, and with tremendous resources expended in that process. And so the context experts, I think, really must be in that creative phase of any initiative where you're trying to understand what the challenges are and what might begin to remedy those challenges. And so with the Graduation Matters work, that's students who have a direct or indirect experience of struggling to stay in school. And so a lot of times, schools go, okay, we get it, we need youth voice. And so they get, a super successful, golly Ned, I never thought about dropping out of school kind of student at the table who just doesn't bring any new understanding to the issue, right? And so the youth voice to us was very much a central part of this work. And the communities that really moved the dial on graduation almost down to the specific examples were the communities that engage student voice. And so then how do you do that, right? And so one of the frameworks that I really appreciate around this is that something I think I got from the Collective Impact Forum, this increasing levels of engagement from inform up to co-lead, and it's a really nice way to line out the different ways that people engage with one another. So, whether that's something that would be easy to share with people after this call, glad to figure that out. But basically, it's understanding that, a lot of times what we do in our engagement work is we inform people. We email newsletters to them. It's a one-way communication. We tell them that we're having a meeting and we hope they come to it. But then the next level of engagement is around consultation. So as you're building a new initiative or building a new program, you consult with people who have lived experience. You say, hey, this is what we understand is what's the problem, and this is what we are starting to think about as possible solutions. Number one, do you agree with us on what that problem is, right? And would you begin to help us think through what we would do about it? And then you start moving into, getting people on working groups and into leadership positions, and you can get the picture. So a very concrete example of that with the youth work was we had a statewide student advisory board meeting twice a year where we had 40 high school students join us for a day and a half and talk about a particular aspect of the challenge to stay in school. And so that we saw them as, as policy advisors, and so we'd give them an hour or so worth of information about a particular issue. We'd facilitate them talking to each other about how that issue connected or didn't connect to their reality, and then we started to facilitate them sharing what this might mean for statewide work. And so that was an example of a way to be very intentional about your way of engaging youth in the structure of your strategies.
Thanks, Deb. I'll ask you one last question before I do that, just for reference, that spectrum that you mentioned. We can share the resources for folks. It's the IAP2 community engagement spectrum, but you're right, it's been adapted in a lot of collective impact contexts. I'll give you 30 to 45 seconds to answer this question, which could probably take much longer, but any just final reflections on how you've gone about building trust among competing nonprofits, or maybe bringing members of the community in who might typically have not been engaged? The one question came up specifically about the Latino community in certain parts of the country that might feel fearful of engaging in a process. Just talk briefly about how you've seen, beyond some of the things you've already spoken to on the 100 Cups of Coffee example of ways to build trust.
You bet. So I think that, that is real. And so in most communities, there's, some people who are trusted within that subculture of that community. And so if you can start with those people who are sort of a little bit of gatekeepers, oftentimes for very understandable reasons, if you can engage a couple gatekeepers in what you're doing and really authentically ask for their guidance. You know, try to not talk a lot during a cup of coffee. Try to ask questions, and if you come across as someone who has some knowledge and has a whole lot of ability to learn and have humility, you get a lot farther. And the last thing I'll say is that you can't underestimate shuttle diplomacy. So thinking you're going to bring a whole bunch of competitive nonprofits in a room and facilitate a nice open conversation, you know, that's probably not the best strategy. You should be doing, you know, having whoever has a relationship with that person should be meeting with that person to begin to understand and tease out the things that are keeping people from having trust with one another.
Thanks, Deb, and for covering a really complex question. I'll turn it back over to Jen.
Yes, I was going to say the same thing. You did the virtual impossible of answering a very tricky question and giving a nugget. I'm sure you could probably share reflections for hours on that last question. But with that, I think we are at our time, and just want to thank you so much, Deb, for joining us today. I know I certainly learned a whole lot listening to you, and I trust everyone on the line did as well. That last question actually is a great setup for the next virtual coffee that we'll be hosting in April, focused on building a community engagement strategy, which a lot of that really has to do, you know, building on a lot of what Deb said about being out in the community and approaches to building trust and really meaningful engagement of members of community, youth, and others. And so for those interested in going much deeper on that topic, we invite you to join us for our virtual coffee next month on April 26th. So thank you so much for joining, and we will be sending out a recording link if you would like to share this with others. And we wish you a great day. Thank you very much.